In the spring of 1854, a Charleston probate clerk opened a sealed envelope that had been sitting in his office for exactly 3 weeks, per the instructions written on its exterior. Inside was a last will and testament that would trigger the most scandalous legal case in South Carolina history, not because of what it gave away, but because of who was giving and who was receiving. The document had been drafted by Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, widow, plantation owner, and one of the wealthiest women in the Low Country. She died on March 3rd at the age of 47, after a brief illness that took her quickly. By all accounts, she'd been a respectable woman. She attended church. She managed her late husband's plantation with shrewd efficiency. She raised her son to be a gentleman. But the will revealed a truth that Eleanor had hidden for nearly a decade, and that truth would force Charleston society to confront a violation so profound that even mentioning it in polite company could end a reputation. Eleanor Whitmore had left her entire fortune, Ashwood Plantation, all 2,300 acres, her Charleston townhouse, her considerable investments, her furniture, her jewelry, everything, to a man named Marcus, a 8-year-old man who appeared in her property ledgers as item number 27, a man who'd been legally owned by Eleanor's family since he was 9 years old. A man whose intelligence, dignity, and presence had made every white visitor to Ashwood deeply uncomfortable for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Her son, Jonathan Whitmore, 26 years old, university-educated, and the presumed heir to everything his parents had built, received exactly nothing. Not a single acre, not a single dollar, not even a piece of his mother's jewelry to remember her by. The will didn't just transfer property, it tore open questions that Southern society had spent 2 centuries trying to keep sealed. Questions about power, about desire, about what happened when a white woman with absolute authority developed feelings for a man she legally owned. Questions about a son who watched his inheritance dissolve before his eyes and had to decide whether family loyalty meant protecting his mother's memory or destroying it. Before we go deeper into Eleanor Whitmore's story and the inheritance that shouldn't have existed, make sure you're subscribed to The Sealed Room. We uncover the stories they tried to bury, the truths that don't appear in sanitized history books. Hit that notification bell because this story gets darker, more complex, and more tragic than you can imagine. And tell us in the comments, have you ever heard of a case like this? Because this one was deliberately erased from the records for over 80 years. Eleanor Catherine Bradford was 19 years old when she married Thomas Whitmore in 1826. It was an excellent match by Charleston standards. She brought a dowry of $15,000, railroad shares, and 40 enslaved people from her father's estate. Thomas brought Ashwood Plantation, inherited from his grandfather, along with its 200 workers, its profitable rice fields, and his family's respected name. They were both from old South Carolina families. They both understood the rules of their world. They both knew how to maintain appearances. For the first decade of their marriage, they did exactly that. Eleanor bore a son, Jonathan, in 1828. She managed the household with efficiency. She oversaw the domestic enslaved people with a firm hand that earned her a reputation as a demanding mistress, but not a cruel one. She attended church every Sunday at St. Michael's. She hosted dinner parties where the conversation focused on cotton prices, politics, and the latest Charleston gossip. She embroidered. She kept meticulous household accounts. She did everything a plantation mistress was expected to do. Thomas ran the agricultural operations. He was a decent manager, not brilliant but competent. The rice fields produced adequately. The cotton brought fair prices. Ashwood wasn't the richest plantation in the Low Country, but it was solid, respectable, and profitable enough to maintain their position in Charleston society. But Thomas had a weakness that many men of his class shared. He drank too much. Not in public, where it might cause scandal, but at night, in his study, working through a bottle of whiskey while going over the account books. The drinking made him mean. He didn't hit Eleanor. That would have been ungentlemanly, but he developed a talent for verbal cruelty that left wounds words couldn't heal. He criticized how she ran the household. He mocked her attempts at conversation. He made it clear that she'd disappointed him by producing only one child and a son who he found too gentle, too bookish, not enough of a man by his standards. Eleanor learned to make herself small in her own house. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned how to read Thomas's moods and adjust accordingly. And she learned that the life she'd imagined as a young bride, the partnership, the companionship, the mutual respect, was never going to exist. Then, in 1836, Thomas died. He was thrown from a horse during a hunt, broke his neck, and was dead before anyone could reach him. He was 42 years old, Eleanor was 29, and suddenly, unexpectedly, she was free. Under South Carolina law, Eleanor inherited a life interest in Ashwood. She couldn't sell the land without Jonathan's consent once he came of age, but she controlled it completely. She made all the management decisions. She controlled the finances. She had, for the first time in her life, power that answered to no one. The first thing she did shocked her family. She fired the overseer, a brutal man named Cyrus Hook, who'd worked for Thomas and who believed that productivity came through the whip. She replaced him with a younger man, Samuel Pierce, who she instructed to reduce the violence. Not eliminate it, that would have been impossible in the system she operated within, but reduce it. She wanted Ashwood to be profitable, but she no longer wanted to hear screaming from the quarters at night. The second thing she did was reorganize how the plantation operated. She began meeting directly with the skilled workers, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the head cook, to understand what they needed to do their jobs better. She listened when they spoke. She implemented some of their suggestions. Productivity increased, not because of violence, but because people worked better when they weren't constantly terrified. The third thing she did was notice Marcus. He'd been at Ashwood since childhood, purchased from a Virginia estate when he was 9 years old, along with his mother. His mother had died when he was 15, leaving him alone in a world where being alone meant being vulnerable. But Marcus had survived by becoming valuable. He'd learned to read somehow, a dangerous skill that he kept carefully hidden. He'd learned carpentry, blacksmithing, and basic medicine. He could fix almost anything. He could solve problems. And he had something else, something harder to quantify. He had presence. When Marcus entered a room, people noticed. When he spoke, which he did rarely, people listened. Thomas had used Marcus primarily in the carpentry shop, and occasionally sent him to Charleston to deliver furniture that Ashwood's workers had built. Thomas had also beaten Marcus more frequently than most of the other enslaved people, as if Marcus's quiet dignity was a personal insult that required correction. Marcus bore the scars on his back and never complained. He simply endured. Eleanor first really saw Marcus 3 months after Thomas's death. A storm had damaged the main house's roof, and Marcus was supervising the repairs. She came outside to inspect the work and found him directing 2 other men with calm efficiency, explaining not just what needed to be done, but why, teaching them as they worked. She asked him a question about the repair timeline. He answered directly, looking at her when he spoke, not at the ground as most enslaved people did when addressing white owners. His eyes were dark brown, intelligent, and utterly without the deference that she'd come to expect. Not defiant, but not broken either. Just present, fully himself, despite everything. She found herself asking him more questions, about the roof, about other repairs needed around the plantation, about his assessment of what Ashwood required to run more efficiently. He answered each question thoughtfully. He didn't volunteer information she hadn't requested, but he didn't hold back either. He spoke to her as if she were capable of understanding complex ideas, which was a novelty. Thomas had never spoken to her that way. She started calling on Marcus more frequently. She'd ask him to review repair proposals from other workers. She'd have him explain agricultural techniques. She'd request his opinion on purchasing decisions. She told herself this was simply practical. Marcus was intelligent and skilled. Using his knowledge was good management. But somewhere in those conversations, something shifted. She began to notice the way he moved with physical grace despite years of hard labor. She noticed his hands, scarred but careful, capable of delicate work. She noticed his voice, deeper than Thomas's had been, without the edge of cruelty she'd learned to flinch from. She noticed that when she spoke, Marcus listened completely, giving her his full attention in a way that made her feel genuinely heard for the first time in her adult life. And God help her, she began to want his attention. She began to find excuses to call him to the main house. She began to extend their conversations beyond what was necessary for plantation business. She began to feel a flutter of anticipation when she knew she'd see him, and a hollowness when several days passed without an encounter. Eleanor understood the danger of what she was feeling. She wasn't naive. She knew what Southern society did to white women who crossed certain lines. She knew the violence that would be visited on any enslaved man suspected of involvement with a white woman. She knew that what she was beginning to want was so far beyond acceptable that even thinking it was a kind of treason against her entire world. But she also understood something else, something that made her sick and exhilarated in equal measure. She owned Marcus, legally, absolutely, completely, which meant that if something did happen between them, the power dynamic was entirely in her control. He couldn't refuse her, he couldn't report her, he couldn't protect himself. Everything that happened would happen because she chose it. That knowledge should have stopped her, should have made her recoil from her own thoughts, but instead it gave her permission, because if she owned him, if she had absolute power over him, then whatever happened was her decision to make. Southern society said that enslaved people existed for their owners' use. Well, she was simply using her property, just not in the way anyone discussed openly. The rationalization was monstrous, and some part of Eleanor knew it. But she'd spent 29 years being powerless, 10 years married to a man who made her feel worthless. She'd been controlled, criticized, and confined her entire life. And now, finally, she had power. And she was going to use it. The first time Eleanor touched Marcus deliberately, intentionally, was in October of 1837, 18 months after Thomas's death. She'd called him to her private study to review plans for expanding the rice fields. They stood side by side at her desk, looking at a surveyor's map. Their shoulders were nearly touching. She could feel the heat from his body. She reached across him to point at something on the map, letting her hand brush against his arm. It was the briefest contact, possibly accidental, but they both knew it wasn't. Marcus went completely still. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Then Marcus carefully stepped back, putting distance between them, and continued explaining the survey in a voice that was perfectly controlled but slightly rougher than it had been moments before. Eleanor dismissed him shortly after. She sat alone in her study for nearly an hour afterward, shaking. She'd crossed a line. A small line, almost invisible, but a line nonetheless. And she wanted desperately to cross it again. Over the next months, she found more excuses for close proximity. She'd ask Marcus to reach books from high shelves while she stood close behind him. She'd have him carry materials to her study and linger while he set them down. She'd create situations where they'd have to pass each other in doorways, where their hands might brush while exchanging documents, where the normal physical boundaries that separated owner and owned could dissolve in ways that seemed accidental. Marcus never initiated contact. He never gave any indication that he welcomed her attention, but he also never refused when she called for him. He never found excuses to avoid her, and sometimes, when their hands touched, she felt him hesitate fractionally before pulling away. That hesitation was enough. It told her that whatever was happening wasn't entirely one-sided, or at least that his body was responding even if his mind knew better. She began requesting that he come to her study in the evenings to review the next day's work. These meetings lasted longer than they needed to. They'd sit across from each other at her desk, the lamp casting shadows between them, and they'd talk, not just about plantation business, but about other things. She'd ask him about books he'd read, how he'd learned to read, what he thought about ideas that no enslaved person should be thinking about. Freedom, philosophy, what made a life worth living. Marcus was careful in how he answered. He never spoke with bitterness about his bondage. He never criticized her or the system she represented. But he spoke with an intelligence and depth that made it clear he'd been thinking about these questions for years, thinking in ways that would have terrified most white owners. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in her life. Here was someone who treated her as an intellectual equal, who challenged her ideas, who made her think. She told herself she was simply lonely, that after years of Thomas's contempt, she craved conversation with someone who respected her mind, that there was nothing more to it than that. But she was lying to herself, and she knew it. The night everything changed was in March of 1838, 2 years after Thomas's death. There had been a difficult situation with one of the field workers, a man who'd collapsed from heat stroke and died despite the efforts to save him. Eleanor had handled the practical matters, the burial, the notification of family, the paperwork, but afterward, alone in her study, she found herself weeping. Not for show, not the delicate tears of a lady, but gasping, ugly crying that she couldn't control. Marcus had been working late on repairs to the kitchen house. He heard her through the open window and came to the study door. He knocked softly, asked if she was all right. She tried to compose herself, tried to send him away, but the words wouldn't come. And then he did something that could have gotten him killed. He came into the room without being invited, closed the door behind him, and stood there, just present, bearing witness to her grief. "I'm sorry," she finally managed. "I shouldn't. It's weakness. It's human," Marcus said quietly. He was 24 years old. He had a wife and a daughter. "Being sad that he's dead isn't weakness. You think I have a right to grieve?" Eleanor looked at him, genuinely curious. "When I'm the one who owns the system that killed him?" Marcus held her gaze. "I think grief doesn't ask permission, and I think you're the first owner I've known who actually seems to understand what you're grieving for." "What am I grieving for?" "The impossibility of it all," Marcus said. "You want to be good, but there's no way to be good and own people. You want to do right, but every choice you make is soaked in wrong. You see us as human, which means you see what owning us actually means. And that makes every day hurt." The accuracy of his words cut through her like a blade. He'd seen her, truly seen her, in ways she hadn't realized anyone could. "How do you bear it?" she whispered. "Seeing so clearly and being powerless to change anything?" "I'm not powerless," Marcus said. "I have very little power, but that's different from none. I choose how I treat people. I choose whether I let this place make me cruel or whether I stay human inside it. I choose to keep thinking, even when thinking makes everything harder. Small choices, but they're mine." Eleanor stood. She moved toward him. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to stop, but she couldn't. She was 31 years old, and she'd never felt genuine desire before. Thomas had been a duty she'd endured. But this was something else entirely. She reached up and touched Marcus's face. He flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. His skin was warm under her palm. "Tell me to stop," she said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You know I can't do that. Because I own you." "Yes. So if this happened, it would be because I chose it, and you had no choice." "Yes." The honesty was devastating. Eleanor dropped her hand and turned away, shame washing over her. "I'm no different from Thomas, from every master who uses people they own for their pleasure. I'm just telling myself it's different because I'm a woman, because I have feelings, because I pretend you have a choice. But you don't. You never did." The silence stretched out. Then Marcus spoke, and his voice was different than she'd ever heard it before. Rough with something that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. "You asked me a question once, about whether I thought you were good. I never answered." Eleanor waited. "You're not good," Marcus said. "Nobody who owns people is good. But you're trying. You see what this system is. You hate it even while you benefit from it. And you're asking questions that most white people never let themselves ask. Does that make what you want from me acceptable? No. Does it make it less monstrous than what other owners do? Maybe. I don't know anymore. He moved closer. Eleanor's breath caught. I've watched you for 2 years, Marcus continued. I've seen you try to be decent in a situation where decency is impossible. I've seen you treat people like humans when the law says we're property. And I've felt something I have no right to feel, that I know is probably just survival instinct dressed up as something else. But that feels real anyway. Marcus, let me finish, because I need to say this once, clearly, so you understand. If something happens between us, it will never be equal. You have all the power. You can destroy me with a word. You own my body, and the law says you can use it however you want. Nothing that happens can be truly consensual when one person owns the other. Nothing. Do you understand that? Yes, Eleanor whispered. And if you touch me anyway, knowing that, you'll be doing what every master does. You'll be taking what you want, because you can. The only difference is, you'll know it's wrong, and you'll have to live with that knowledge. Eleanor should have walked away, should have dismissed him, maintained the boundaries, protected them both from the catastrophe she could feel approaching. But she'd been powerless for so long. And he was standing there, intelligent and alive, and seeing her for exactly what she was, and she wanted him with a desperation that obliterated judgment. She kissed him. Marcus went rigid, and for a terrible moment she thought he'd push her away, thought she'd misjudged everything. But then his hands came up to her shoulders, not pulling her closer but not pushing her away either, just holding her, and he kissed her back with an intensity that suggested this wasn't survival instinct, wasn't strategic accommodation, but something as real and unwanted as what she felt. When they broke apart, they were both shaking. "This is going to destroy us both," Marcus said. "I know. People will die if this is discovered. I will die. I know. And you're going to do this anyway." It wasn't a question. Eleanor pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart hammering as hard as her own. "I've been dead inside for so long. I know that's not an excuse. I know this makes me monstrous, but I can't. I can't stop." Marcus's arms came around her, careful, as if he was still expecting to be struck for the presumption. "Then we'll be monstrous together. And we'll try not to get caught, and we'll probably fail, and they'll kill me for it. I won't let them. You won't be able to stop them." He was right. They both knew it. But in that moment, with his arms around her and years of loneliness finally cracking open, Eleanor didn't care. She'd spent her whole life being good, being proper, following the rules, and it had brought her nothing but misery. Maybe being monstrous would at least feel like living. What followed was a relationship that existed in the narrowest possible space between discovery and survival. They were careful in ways that required constant vigilance. Marcus came to her study only late at night, and only when the household was asleep. They never touched in daylight. They never showed familiarity in front of others. Eleanor maintained her distant, authoritative demeanor with Marcus in public, treating him exactly as she treated every other enslaved person on the plantation. In private, they created a world that shouldn't have existed. They talked for hours. They shared books, Marcus reading by lamplight, while Eleanor watched him, marveling that this was allowed, that she could simply look at him and want him, and not have to hide it when they were alone. They argued about philosophy, politics, what the world could be if it were built on different foundations. And yes, they were intimate in ways that Eleanor had never imagined possible. Thomas had taken his physical rights as a husband with mechanical efficiency and no consideration for her experience. With Marcus, everything was different. He was careful with her, attentive in ways that suggested he actually cared whether she felt pleasure. It was intoxicating. It was addictive. And it was fundamentally wrong in ways that Eleanor couldn't reconcile with the fact that it felt like the first honest thing in her life. The guilt ate at her constantly. She was doing exactly what plantation masters did. She was using someone who couldn't refuse her. The fact that Marcus seemed to want her didn't change the fundamental power imbalance. The fact that she cared about him didn't make the relationship less exploitative. Every time they were together, she was committing the same violation that she condemned in others. Just because she felt guilty about it didn't make it better. It just made her a hypocrite. Marcus seemed to carry his own guilt. Sometimes, after, he'd lie beside her in silence, and she could feel him withdrawing into himself, processing something she couldn't reach. "What are you thinking?" she'd ask. "That I'm betraying every principle I have," he'd say. "That I'm collaborating with my own bondage, that I've let myself care about someone who owns me, and that makes me weak. Do you want to stop? If I say yes, would you let me?" The question hung between them, unanswerable, because they both knew the truth. She wouldn't force him to continue if he genuinely wanted to end it, but he couldn't know whether that was true. He couldn't trust that her professed respect for his autonomy wasn't just another form of manipulation. The power dynamic poisoned every interaction, made every moment of tenderness suspect. But they didn't stop. For 3 years, they maintained their impossible secret. Eleanor became more radical in her thinking, more aware of the evil she participated in. She couldn't free Marcus. That would draw too much attention, raise too many questions. But she began making quiet changes. She allowed enslaved families to stay together when normally they'd be separated. She invested in better housing, better food, better medical care. She stopped using the whip as punishment except in cases where refusing would have aroused suspicion. Ashwood became known as an unusually well-managed plantation, profitable but not brutal. And then in 1841, everything became more complicated. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Eleanor was 34 years old. She'd given birth to Jonathan 13 years earlier and had assumed her childbearing years were mostly behind her. Thomas had been dead for 5 years. There was no plausible explanation for a pregnancy that wouldn't destroy everything. When she first suspected, she considered ending it. There were women who knew things, herbs and procedures that could solve this problem quietly. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the years of loneliness before Marcus. Maybe it was the knowledge that this child would be part of him, would carry his intelligence, his dignity, his humanity. Maybe it was simply that after years of feeling dead inside, creating life felt like proof that she was still capable of something real. But she couldn't keep the child. That was the brutal reality. A white widow becoming pregnant years after her husband's death would create scandal enough. But if the child was born with any features that suggested African ancestry, it wouldn't just be scandal. It would be investigation. People would start asking questions, and those questions would lead inevitably to Marcus, and Marcus would be killed for it. She told Marcus immediately. His reaction was controlled, but she could see the fear beneath it. "What do you want to do?" he asked carefully. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I know what I should do. I know what's safe. But She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "If you have this child, you understand what has to happen. The child can't be raised white, can't be raised as yours. The child will have to be enslaved, legally, to protect us both." The words landed like blows. Eleanor had spent 3 years trying to reconcile her relationship with Marcus, with her opposition to slavery. She'd told herself that what they had was different, that it transcended the brutal system they existed within. But this made the impossibility concrete. Her own child would be born into bondage because acknowledging the child as hers would destroy them all. "I would own my own baby," she said softly. "Yes. Could you forgive me for that?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. "You already own me. You already own every child born at Ashwood. This child would just be one more in a list of atrocities. The only difference is we'd both know the truth of whose child it is." Eleanor began to cry, harsh sobs that she tried to muffle. Marcus held her, and there was something terrible in the tenderness of it. They were discussing enslaving their own child, and he was comforting her about it, and the grotesque inversion of what should be natural made her want to scream. But she didn't end the pregnancy. She told the household staff that she'd be spending several months in Charleston for her health. She went to the townhouse and stayed there, seeing almost no one, wearing loose dresses that hid the changes in her body. Only her most trusted house servant, a woman named Hannah who'd been with Eleanor since her marriage, knew the truth, and Hannah was too loyal and too afraid of the consequences to speak of it. The child was born in May of 1842, a girl. She had Eleanor's pale skin, but Marcus's features were there in the shape of her eyes, the set of her mouth. In certain lights, to anyone who looked closely, the child's parentage would be obvious. Eleanor held her daughter for less than an hour. Then Hannah took the baby to Ashwood with instructions that the child was to be raised in the quarters, registered in the plantation ledgers as the daughter of a woman named Sarah who'd recently died in childbirth. The story was that Eleanor, in an unusual act of charity, was taking responsibility for the orphaned infant rather than selling her away. The child was named Ruth. Eleanor returned to Ashwood 2 weeks later, claiming her health had improved. She saw Ruth occasionally in the quarters, but never allowed herself to hold the child, never allowed herself to show any special interest. Ruth grew up believing she was an orphan, believing that the distant white woman who owned the plantation was simply her master, nothing more. The experience broke something in Eleanor. She'd always understood intellectually that slavery was evil, but now she felt it in her bones. She'd given birth to a child and then enslaved that child to protect herself. She'd prioritized her own safety and reputation over her daughter's freedom. Every principle she'd claimed to have, every moral position she'd tried to maintain, had collapsed the moment it actually cost her something. Marcus withdrew from her after Ruth's birth. Not completely, but the intimacy between them became strained, haunted by what they'd done. When they were together, Ruth's existence hung in the air between them, unspoken but suffocating. They'd created a life, and immediately betrayed it in the most fundamental way possible. "Do you hate me?" Eleanor asked him one night, months after Ruth's birth. "I hate what we are," Marcus said. "I hate that we did this. I hate that we're going to keep doing this, because neither of us is strong enough to stop. I hate that I still want you despite knowing what you're capable of. Does that count as hate?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "I think it does." But he was right. They didn't stop. If anything, the relationship intensified, taking on a desperate quality. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd proven themselves capable of monstrous choices. And having made those choices, there seemed less reason to hold back from other transgressions. Jonathan, meanwhile, was growing into a young man who concerned Eleanor deeply. He'd been 15 when Ruth was born, old enough to notice his mother's strange absence, old enough to hear the whispered gossip that she'd tried to suppress. He didn't know the truth, but he suspected something was wrong, and his response to that suspicion was to become aggressively conventional, as if by being the perfect Charleston gentleman he could compensate for whatever scandal his mother might have created. He attended the College of Charleston and excelled. He learned to manage plantation operations alongside the new overseer Eleanor had hired. He became vocal in his support of slavery, of states' rights, of Southern sovereignty. He spoke with contempt about abolitionists and Northern aggression. And he watched Marcus with an intensity that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Mother," Jonathan said to her one evening in 1849, when he was 21, "I've been thinking about the future of Ashwood. When I inherit, I plan to expand operations. We're not as profitable as we should be. You've been too lenient with the workers. Productivity has suffered. Productivity has increased every year since your father died," Eleanor said calmly. "It could be better, and your relationship with certain workers is inappropriate. People talk, Mother." The room went very still. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's voice was ice. "Marcus, you spend too much time consulting with him. It creates a bad precedent. The other slaves see him going to your study, see him having private conversations with you. It undermines proper hierarchy. When I take over, that will change." "When you take over," Eleanor repeated. "That won't be for many years, Jonathan. I'm only 42. I'm in perfect health. Nevertheless, I think we should discuss the transition. Perhaps I should take on more management responsibilities now. Perhaps you should consider stepping back from direct involvement. It was a power play. Jonathan was 21, educated, and eager to assert control, and he'd identified the one thing that made Eleanor vulnerable. He didn't know about the relationship, not really, but he'd noticed the attention she paid to Marcus, and he was smart enough to use that as leverage. Eleanor understood that her son would never know the truth, could never know the truth. If Jonathan ever discovered that Marcus was more than just a skilled worker, that Ruth was his half-sister, the consequences would be catastrophic. Jonathan wouldn't protect them. He'd feel humiliated, betrayed, and he'd do exactly what society expected. He'd have Marcus killed and Ruth sold, and he'd present it as defending his family's honor. That night, Eleanor made a decision that would define everything that followed. She called her attorney, William Prescott, to Ashwood. Prescott had handled her affairs since Thomas's death, and had proven both discreet and competent. She told him she wanted to update her will. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," Prescott said. "I assume you'll be formalizing Jonathan's inheritance of the plantation?" "No," Eleanor said. "I want to make alternative arrangements." What followed was a series of conversations that left Prescott increasingly alarmed. Eleanor wanted to structure her will in a way that would protect certain people after her death. She was careful about how she phrased things, never admitting the full truth, but making her intentions clear enough that Prescott could execute them. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prescott said after their third meeting, "what you're proposing is highly irregular. If you disinherit Jonathan entirely, he will contest, and the beneficiary you're suggesting, this will create enormous legal complications." "I understand the complications," Eleanor said. "That's why I need your best legal thinking. I need this structured in a way that will survive a court challenge. May I ask why you're doing this?" Eleanor looked at him directly. "Because I've spent my entire life following the rules of a society I've come to recognize as fundamentally evil. I've compromised my principles at every turn. I've hurt people I should have protected, and I'm going to die one day, Mr. Prescott, probably sooner than later, and when I do, I want to at least try to correct one fraction of the damage I've done. I know this is complicated, I know it will be ugly, but I need you to help me do this right." Prescott worked on the will for months. He researched precedents, consulted with specialists in property law, and crafted a document that was legally innovative in its attempt to accomplish what Eleanor wanted. The key was using trust structures, carefully worded manumission clauses, and taking advantage of certain provisions in South Carolina law that allowed property to be transferred in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The final will, executed in March of 1850, contained provisions that wouldn't become public until after Eleanor's death. It granted immediate freedom to Marcus upon her death, along with a substantial monetary bequest. It granted freedom to Ruth, with funds sufficient for her education and support. And most shockingly, it transferred the entirety of Ashwood Plantation, all its lands, all its operations, and all remaining enslaved people, into a trust with Marcus as the primary beneficiary and administrator. Jonathan received nothing. Eleanor drafted a letter to be opened with the will, explaining her reasoning. The letter didn't reveal the full truth of her relationship with Marcus, but it made clear that she'd come to believe slavery was evil, that she couldn't free all the enslaved people at Ashwood without causing chaos that would harm them more than help, but that she could at least ensure Marcus had the power to manage their transition to freedom gradually and thoughtfully. It was a fantasy, Eleanor knew. She was trying to use law to correct moral catastrophe, trying to write a document that would somehow make right what had been wrong from the beginning. But it was all she could do. She couldn't change what she'd been. She couldn't undo her past choices. But she could at least try to protect the people she'd harmed in the process. She never told Marcus about the will. She was afraid of what it would mean, afraid that knowing would change things between them. Better to let him think she was just another plantation owner, just another white woman using her power over him. At least that way, the relationship had a strange kind of honesty to it. The years passed. Ruth grew into a beautiful, intelligent child who worked in the main house and who Eleanor watched from a distance with an ache that never subsided. Marcus remained at her side, their relationship continuing in the shadows, both of them aging into their roles, both of them carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. Jonathan became increasingly vocal about his plans for Ashwood's future, increasingly impatient for his inheritance, increasingly suspicious of his mother's management. And then in February of 1854, Eleanor caught pneumonia. It started as a slight cough, nothing alarming, but it progressed rapidly. Within a week she was bedridden. Within 2 weeks, the doctor told her privately that her lungs were filling with fluid and there was nothing more he could do. She had perhaps days remaining, and in those days she finally told Marcus the truth about what she'd done. Marcus sat beside Eleanor's bed in the main house, a violation of every social code that would have been unthinkable under different circumstances. But Eleanor was dying, and she'd dismissed everyone else from the room. Let them talk. She'd be dead before the scandal could touch her. "I changed my will," she said, her voice weak but clear. 4 years ago. You need to know what's in it before I die." Marcus went very still. "Eleanor, listen, please." She told him everything. The trust, the manumission, the transfer of Ashwood to his control, Ruth's freedom and financial provision, Jonathan's disinheritance. As she spoke, she watched the color drain from Marcus's face. "You can't have done this," he said when she finished. "They'll kill me. The moment that will is read, they'll kill me." Prescott structured it carefully. "The manumission takes effect immediately upon my death. You'll be legally free. They can't kill a free man without legal process." "You think the law will protect me?" Marcus's voice rose, something that had never happened before. "You think a piece of paper will stop an angry white mob from dragging me out of this house and hanging me from the nearest tree? Eleanor, you've sentenced me to death. I'm trying to give you freedom." "I don't want your freedom." The words exploded from him. "I wanted to survive. I wanted to keep my head down and make it through each day, and maybe, if I was lucky, die of old age instead of violence, and you've made that impossible. The moment that will becomes public, I'm a dead man." Eleanor tried to reach for his hand, but he pulled away. "Marcus, I had to do something. Ruth is your daughter. Ruth deserves not to watch her father be murdered. Ruth deserves not to be sold away when Jonathan contests this will and wins, because he will win. Eleanor, no court in South Carolina is going to uphold a will that gives a plantation to an enslaved man. They'll call you insane. They'll say I manipulated you. And then they'll kill me and sell Ruth, and everything you tried to do will just make it worse." "Then run," Eleanor said desperately. "Take Ruth and run north. The will gives you money. Use it to get away before Jonathan can stop you." "Run where?" "We're in South Carolina in 1854. Ruth is 12 years old. I'm a 4 or 5-year-old man who spent his entire life enslaved. We have no papers, no connections in the north, no way to protect ourselves if we're caught. And they will catch us, because Jonathan will hunt us. You've given him every reason to destroy us." The truth of his words settled over the room like ash. Eleanor had tried to fix things, to make amends, to use her death as a kind of redemption, but all she'd done was create a new catastrophe. She'd put Marcus and Ruth in more danger than they'd ever been in before, and she'd done it thinking she was being noble. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I could protect you." "You can't protect me," Marcus said, and his voice was suddenly very tired. "You never could. That was always the lie we told ourselves, that you were different, that you cared, that somehow your power over me was less brutal because you felt guilty about it. But in the end, you did what every white owner does. You decided what was best for me without asking, and now I'll pay the price. Tell me what to do. I'll change the will. You're dying, Eleanor. There's nothing you can do. The will is written, Prescott has it. And in a few days, you'll be dead, and the rest of us will have to live with the consequences of your choices." He stood to leave. Eleanor grabbed his hand with the last strength she had. "Did you ever love me? Even a little?" Or was it always just survival? Marcus looked at her, and his expression was so complex she couldn't read it. I don't know. I've asked myself that question for 16 years. Maybe I loved you. Maybe I just convinced myself I did because it was easier than admitting I was just a body you used. Maybe love isn't even possible between owner and owned. Maybe everything we had was just a beautiful lie we told each other to make the horror more bearable. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. He pulled his hand free. Goodbye, Eleanor. I hope whatever God you pray to has mercy on your soul, because I don't think I can. He left. Eleanor died 2 days later, on March 3rd, 1854, at 47 years old. She died alone, having sent everyone away. Her last thoughts were of Marcus's face as he walked out of her room, and of Ruth, who didn't know that her mother had just died. The will was read in William Prescott's office on March 12th, exactly as Eleanor had specified. Jonathan arrived expecting a formality, expecting to be confirmed as the heir to everything his father and grandfather had built. Instead, Prescott read a document that shattered his entire understanding of his life. Jonathan's reaction was volcanic. He stood, overturning his chair. He shouted that his mother had been insane, had been manipulated, had been corrupted by Northern abolition sympathies. He demanded that Prescott burn the will immediately and produce the previous version that left everything to Jonathan. I cannot do that, Prescott said quietly. Your mother was of sound mind when she executed this will. I witnessed it personally. The document is legally valid. A will that gives my family's plantation to a slave. To Marcus, of all people? This is obscene. It's impossible. No court will honor this. The manumission clauses take effect immediately. Prescott continued, Marcus is no longer enslaved. He is a free man of color. The property transfers to a trust with Marcus as administrator. The terms are complex, but they were carefully structured to comply with South Carolina law. Jonathan's face went through several colors. Then something seemed to click in his mind. He looked at Prescott with dawning horror. How long? His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry? How long was she fucking him? The vulgarity hung in the air. Prescott maintained his composure. Mr. Whitmore, I have no knowledge of... Don't lie to me, that's what this is about, isn't it? My mother was whoring with her property, and now she's trying to buy his silence from beyond the grave. Jonathan's voice was shaking with rage and humiliation. How many people know? How long has Charleston been laughing at me? No one knows anything, Prescott said firmly. Your mother's will is unusual, but she has the right to dispose of her property as she sees fit. If you wish to contest it, that is your prerogative. But I would caution you that a public court battle will expose details that might be better left private. Private? Jonathan laughed bitterly. There's nothing private about this. She left everything to a slave. Everyone will know what that means. Everyone will know my mother was... He couldn't finish the sentence. He stormed out of Prescott's office and went directly to the magistrate to file a contest of the will. He hired 3 attorneys, all specialists in property law, and all perfectly willing to take on a case that would allow them to argue for the preservation of proper social order. Within a week, the case had become the talk of Charleston. The public response split along predictable lines. Most of Charleston's elite supported Jonathan. A white woman leaving her estate to an enslaved man was an affront to every principle the South was built on. It suggested that enslaved people could be equals, could be trusted with power, could be something other than property. If Eleanor Whitmore's will was allowed to stand, what did that mean for everyone else's arrangements? But there was another response, quieter but significant. Some people, particularly women who'd been trapped in loveless marriages, saw something else in Eleanor's choice. They saw a woman trying to correct a lifetime of compromise. They saw someone refusing to let death be the final word on her complicity. They didn't condone the relationship, but they understood the desperation that might drive someone to it. The legal battle consumed the next year. Jonathan's attorneys argued diminished capacity, undue influence, and violation of public policy. They called witnesses who testified that Eleanor had seemed distracted in her final years, had made unusual decisions, had shown favoritism to certain enslaved people. They argued that no sane white woman would do what Eleanor had done, therefore she must have been insane. Prescott countered with evidence of Eleanor's careful management, her profitable operations, her clear thinking in all other areas of life. He produced letters she'd written to business associates that showed sophisticated understanding of financial matters. He produced testimony from doctors that she'd been in full possession of her faculties right up until her final illness. The case's turning point came when Prescott made a strategic decision. He called Marcus to testify. It was unprecedented. Enslaved people, or even recently freed people of color, rarely testified in cases involving white families. But Prescott argued that Marcus's testimony was essential to understanding Eleanor's intentions. The judge, a cautious man named Thomas Waring, allowed it over strenuous objection. Marcus took the stand, wearing simple but clean clothes. He looked directly at the judge when he spoke, his voice steady despite the hostile courtroom. Jonathan's lead attorney, a vicious litigator named Edmund Fraser, immediately tried to destroy him. "You were Mrs. Whitmore's property, were you not?" "Until her death, yes." "And you had access to her private study?" "Mrs. Whitmore consulted with me on plantation management." "How convenient. A slave who managed the plantation while his mistress managed other things." Prescott objected. Judge Waring sustained it, but the implication hung in the air. Fraser continued. "Did you have intimate relations with Mrs. Whitmore?" The courtroom went silent. Marcus met Fraser's eyes. "I will not answer that question." "You refuse to answer?" "I will not answer any question that would dishonor Mrs. Whitmore's memory or put myself at risk of violence." "Your Honor," Fraser turned to the judge, "the witness is being evasive." "The witness is being prudent," Judge Waring said dryly. "Given that there are men in this courtroom who would happily lynch him based on his answer, I will allow his refusal." Fraser changed tactics. "Do you believe you deserve to inherit Ashwood Plantation?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his words would be reported in every Charleston newspaper the next day. "I don't know what I deserve. I know what Mrs. Whitmore wanted. She spent the last 4 years of her life trying to construct a legal framework that would free the people she owned and give them resources to survive that freedom. She chose me to administer that framework because she believed I had the intelligence and integrity to do it fairly. Whether I deserve that trust, history will judge. But I do know this. The question you're really asking is whether someone who looks like me can be trusted with power. And the answer that terrifies you is that maybe I can. Maybe I'm just as capable as any white man of managing land and making decisions and treating people with dignity. And if that's true, then everything your society is built on is a lie. The courtroom erupted. Judge Waring had to recess for an hour. Jonathan sat white-faced, staring at Marcus with undisguised hatred. And in that moment, everyone present understood that this wasn't just about one inheritance. It was about the entire foundation of Southern society. Judge Waring took 3 months to issue his ruling. When it came, it surprised everyone. He upheld the will, but with modifications. Marcus would receive his freedom and a monetary bequest of $10,000, enough to establish himself but not enough to be threatening. Ruth would receive her freedom and $5,000. But Ashwood Plantation would be sold, with the proceeds divided 60% to Jonathan and 40% to the trust that would be administered by Prescott, not Marcus, for the benefit of the enslaved people being freed from Ashwood. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but that Judge Waring clearly felt was the only sustainable solution. In his written opinion, he acknowledged Eleanor's right to dispose of her property, but also recognized the social disruption that would result from placing a plantation directly under the control of a recently freed man of color. Jonathan received enough to maintain his status, but not the plantation itself. Marcus received his freedom and funds sufficient to start a new life, but not the power Eleanor had tried to give him. The enslaved people of Ashwood would be gradually freed and provided with resources, but under white supervision to ensure it happened appropriately. Everyone appealed. The case dragged on for another year, but ultimately, Judge Waring's compromise stood. In 1856, Ashwood Plantation was sold to a consortium of Charleston investors. The physical place that had been home to generations disappeared into new ownership. Jonathan took his inheritance and moved to Georgia, where no one knew his family history. He married, had children, and lived a respectable life as a cotton broker. He never spoke of his mother. If his children asked about their grandmother, he told them she died when he was young and changed the subject. Marcus took his $10,000 and Ruth, now 14 years old, and left South Carolina. They went to Philadelphia, where free black communities had established themselves and where the danger of re-enslavement was slightly less immediate. Marcus opened a small carpentry shop. He never married, dedicating himself to raising Ruth and building a life that was genuinely his own for the first time. Ruth learned the truth about her parentage when she was 16. Marcus sat her down and told her everything. Eleanor's relationship with him, the compromise and complicity, the impossible choices, the attempt at redemption that had failed in its execution but succeeded in giving them freedom. Ruth processed the information with remarkable maturity. "So, my mother tried to make amends," she said slowly. "She tried," Marcus agreed. "Whether she succeeded, I don't know. She freed us. But she also enslaved you for 12 years when she could have found another way. She loved me, maybe, but she also owned me. Everything about her is complicated. Can I hate her and be grateful to her at the same time?" "Yes," Marcus said, "I do." Ruth became a teacher. She married a free black man from New York and had 3 children. She lived until 1903, long enough to see the turn of the century, long enough to watch her grandchildren grow up in a world still broken but undeniably different from the one she'd been born into. Marcus lived until 1889. In his final years, he wrote a memoir that was never published during his lifetime, but that survived in manuscript form. In it, he tried to make sense of his relationship with Eleanor, the power dynamic that had defined it, the genuine connection that had existed despite the impossibility of true consent. "I don't know if I loved her," he wrote. "Love requires choice, and I never had that. But I know that she saw me as human when most of her world insisted I was property. I know that she tried, in her limited way, to resist the system she was born into, and I know that her attempt at redemption, flawed and catastrophic as it was, gave me and my daughter a chance at freedom. Whether that absolves her of the evil she participated in, I cannot say, but I do know that she was more than just another owner. She was a person trapped in her own cage, and she broke herself trying to break mine. That has to count for something, even if I'm still not sure what." The case of Whitmore Estate versus Whitmore set no lasting legal precedent. It was too unusual, too morally complicated, too threatening to cite as an example. But it existed in the records, a testament to the impossible tangles that slavery created, the ways that ownership corrupted every human relationship it touched, the desperate attempts at redemption that were always too little and too late. Eleanor Whitmore tried to be good in a system that made goodness impossible. She tried to use her power to correct her own complicity. She failed in most of what she attempted. But she did give 2 people their freedom, and in the brutal calculus of that time and place, even failed redemption was more than most people managed. What do you think? Was Eleanor Whitmore a victim of her circumstances or an architect of her own moral corruption? Could love exist between owner and owned, or was everything between them just elaborate violence? Did her final attempt at redemption mean anything when it came too late and caused so much pain? These are questions that don't have easy answers, questions that America still wrestles with when we're honest about our history. This is the kind of story we uncover here at the Sealed Room, the uncomfortable truths, the moral complexity, the human beings trapped in systems that destroyed everyone they touched. If you want more stories from history's darkest corners, subscribe and hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments, have you ever heard of cases like this? Because there are more stories like Eleanor and Marcus hidden in courthouse archives across the South, waiting for someone to finally tell them. The past is never as simple as we want it to be, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that no one wanted remembered.